As the war in Ukraine is about to enter its fifth year and US President Donald Trump desperately chases a Nobel Prize, the subject of peace dominates discussion in the media and elsewhere. But what exactly do we mean by the term peace? And how is our understanding of peacemaking changing and being challenged by current developments? To discuss all this, I'm joined by Professor Oliver Richmond, Professor of International Relations, Conflict and Peace Studies at Manchester University and author of Peace, A Very Short Introduction. So, hi, Oliver. Thanks so much for joining us. I guess the first question is, what exactly do we mean by peace? I think, most of us, we use this term a lot. We probably have some idea in our minds about what it means, but it might be useful to sort of explain how you, as somebody sort of very much immersed in the field, understands this term.
Well, historically, peace has been thought of as a victor's peace, one which is written by the most powerful states or empires based on their victories, mainly aimed at controlling land and resources and having a population which they can extract labor and military assets from. So this, historic version of peace has been something which has dogged us throughout our history, and there's been various attempts to deal with it, to mitigate it, because it keeps leading to full-on disasters where conflicts escalate between great powers, and we have a lot of dead people, injured people, destroyed resources, cities, towns, and countries, wasted resources, and so on. So it always seems to lead in the long term, but often quite quickly, to major escalation in which we're confronted with large-scale military conflicts, which needs major mobilization of resources, military assets, intelligence, and populations. I think looking back, there's always been a tradition of looking at that version of peace as something which is far too limited and too dangerous and doesn't really deal with the sorts of justice claims or claims for representational rights that populations require. And so there have been long-standing attempts throughout our different civilizations in history to come up with a way of mitigating or checking and balancing that very negative version of a victor's peace, which keeps leading to blow-ups. So there are other traditions which suggest that we need to put the human being and the community at the forefront of our thinking about peace. And when we do that, we get quite a different picture of what peace is. It often relates to livelihoods, the good life, basically. And then this points to the billion or trillion dollar question of human civilizational history, which is, how do you build political systems and political orders which are inherently peace-oriented rather than keep resorting to violence to meet the interests of the key actors in any political system, whether it's elites or civil society, social movements, and general population. So that tradition also is more of a philosophical, often a religious tradition, actually, which foregrounds the needs and interests of ordinary people. We might call it an everyday peace, which is quite different to a victor's peace.
So, I think sort of following on from that, so you mentioned right at the start that we have traditionally understood, or at least in a general level, that peace is a victor's peace. It's that old adage about, history being written by the victors. But from what you say, there is a much deeper tradition that has existed throughout history of understanding peace in a more expansive sense. That isn't just about elites that go to war with each other, but there have been those who've thought about this. And you mentioned some of these traditions. It would be sort of really interesting to hear a little bit more about this, because obviously we so often, when we talk about historical developments, we think of it in this very Eurocentric way. But I know that you've sort of looked at this in a much more global sense and really explored some of these other alternative ideas to peace.
Yeah, so I've been working on this framework, which I've been calling an international peace architecture, a long-standing historical set of practices, processes, and systems, frameworks, if you like, for understanding how peace comes about. And it works in two main ways: top down, when political elites realize that their interests are best met by accommodation, a mutual negotiation, and building up systems, whether it's of international law or constitutional law, rights, checks and balances, and the redistribution of resources to try and find ways of answering humanity's key requirements for innovation without having to resort to extractive, warlike processes. And the other is the kind of bottom-up framework for thinking about peace, which puts upon political elites and systems some kind of responsibility for protecting the security and the good life for populations in different regions. And this involves then, if you like, thinking about the kinds of processes which divide, polarize, and mobilize populations and finding ways around it. I mean, that's not to say that populations are inherently peaceable and that elites are prone to war, but it does suggest that there are structural forces which push both sets in these directions, either of peace and war. So you can either look at it from the top-down point of view and talk about how mobilization occurs, how political interests drive mobilization, what's fought over, how that fighting is done. And then at the end of a war where a victor ensues or emerges or a stalemate ensues, how they then get together around a table, as it were, and hammer out a plan, a peace treaty, a new constitutional order, a new regional balance of power, and those sorts of things. Or you can look at the social, cultural, indigenous traditions of communities who are long used to dealing with conflict over land, over resources, things like farming, space, also representation, questions of equality, which groups are represented, and ultimately, who else joins the table? Who else is there in the room when the peace treaty is being hammered out? And you can say, to cut a very long story short, that either the victors write the peace, and this tends to have some structural stability for a while, but then may collapse if interests shift and power relations shift, or the victims write the peace by virtue of their, in a way, quite privileged position, seeing the forces of violence and politics playing out from below, understanding how they're affected, perhaps having a more intimate understanding of the kinds of things that drive social as well as political conflict, and drawing on their resources and understanding of their particular contexts in order to try to come up with, if you like, micro-level processes where communities begin to accommodate each other, begin to share resources, find new ways of drawing boundaries if necessary, define identities as more pluralistic, and these sorts of things. And these are two opposed, if you like, long-standing traditions of peacemaking in our history. Sometimes they converge, and we end up with a large-scale systemic solution to a conflict, which then brings in the local and the social actors and the communities, also allows some kind of normative alignment over the nature of the polity itself. So which type of polity is less prone to violence and war, and is then also able to, if you like, mitigate or check and balance those crude interests that play out violently at the top table or around these issues of regional power and territorial control and resource extraction. So it seems to be in history that we have this possibility of convergence and alignment between these different layers and levels of politics relating to peace. Or we have the other alternative in which convergence and alignment is forced into a victor's peace by dominant powers rather than local consent and the resources that might be drawn on to build that up, scale it up to a larger global system. I mean, the whole history of European conflict, from the kind of religious and imperial conflicts through to the attempt to build an international architecture in the 20th century with the UN, revolves around this question of whether peace comes through this massive alignment or whether peace comes through domination and authoritarianism, autocracy, and top-down control.
So I think, there are a number of themes there that I'd like to come back to. But I think, again, one of the things that I find really interesting from a historical point of view is, so we're talking a lot at the moment about, peacemaking. We have Trump doing whatever he's doing, and another thing that we'll come back to a little later. And again, we've talked about this victor's peace, but is there also a tradition that we can sort of look back into history and say, there is actually a tradition of mediation, and some of those examples of where outside actors, forces, powers have stepped into conflicts before one side has won a decisive victory or another? Because we do seem to think of that as a sort of rather modern idea, but surely there is a longer history that stretches back on this.
Yeah, I mean, it takes us all the way back to, the old Roman adage, who shall guard the guardians, which also has a longer tradition before that. The way of looking at that in the modern era has been to say we need large-scale international cooperation. And it's through those systems and institutions, international law, institutions like the UN, the EU, all the regional organizations, and so on, that we get to a point where outside actors have sufficient legitimacy, authority, and resources to intervene to protect victims in a conflict. And from that point, they can use that, we might call it peacekeeping, or military intervention in certain circumstances. If we compare, I don't know, Cyprus and the Congo to Iraq and Afghanistan more recently, get to a point where you can then start to design a peace settlement. And the idea of the peace settlement historically has expanded. So initially a settlement was a small treaty. There's a very nice painting, I think, from the 1600s, which is in Somerset House in London, of peace negotiation between the English and Spanish leaders. And it's just it's a group of middle-aged white men around a large table, in very sumptuous surroundings. They've obviously hammered out a treaty, and it sits on the table in front of one of the participants in this negotiation. And it's just a very small piece of paper, and you can just about make out a few points. So this is a very small scale peace treaty, which is really aimed at the big issues, where the boundaries are, who has authority, when the ceasefire will take effect, and what happens after the ceasefire in terms of the reorganization of forces and interests. Perhaps with a coda which says something like, and henceforth, rather than going to war, we will convene a conference, have a meeting, and we will ultimately use a process of dialogue to resolve our conflicts. If you move several centuries into the future, what you have then is this question of, well, let's go further than that. How do you design a political system which you can move from knowledge, from what we know best about peacemaking, into practice? And this is what happened, in the latter part of the 20th century after the end of the Cold War. Many of the ideological questions seem to be settled. And so we had a sense that we knew what peace was. Peace would be best served by democracy and human rights, rule of law, transparency, a free and fair media, international cooperation, and that there had to be international bodies who would be tasked with mediation and peacekeeping, who had the authority, the resources, and could mobilize quickly to stop the killing. Once they'd done that, so call that peacekeeping and mediation and international diplomacy, a UN Security Council resolution, and so on. Once those steps have been gone through, then the question is what type of settlement would lead to a better and more peaceful order. And the answer to that has been, until recently at least, with the advent of Trump, has been, let's create democracy, let's have a rule of law, and all of those things that are inherent in the long-standing tradition of political liberalism. So, mediation is a key part of that, because mediation is not just then about finding a kind of mutually acceptable agreement between enemies, and that agreement could just be an open book, a question mark. Every agreement would be different, as it were, which meant that it often selected very limited parameters because of the nature of the groups who would be involved in mediation and in negotiation. Mediation would mean that we knew where we were going. So once you started the peace process, it wasn't just about removing violence and then settling for whatever the military and political parameters had come out of the war, losses or not, victims or not, injustice or not. But it meant that any peace process had to be much bigger, much more comprehensive, had to rebuild the state or states in question, and had to provide all of these different channels, not just for a one-shot mediation process with a signed small document, but for long-standing, never-ending political processes in which dialogue, discourse, lawmaking, constitution building, economic adjustments, free trade, all of these things would all work together. So the complexity is rising. And as the complexity of peacemaking has risen over the years, it's become more expensive, more energy dependent. It needs more resources. It needs more people. So we're not just talking about single mediators anymore, great figures, the US president or the UN Secretary General, or a very respected elder amongst the international community's set of leaders. But we're actually talking about a wide set of actors who do different things. They work on civil society, they work on school textbooks, they work on development, they work on demobilization, they work on security matters, reintegrating the military, dealing with matters relating to security services, rebuilding and changing, reforming the constitution, opening the country up to international trade flows, bringing those former conflict-affected countries into international and regional organizations. It's a huge level of complexity here in peacemaking, which has far transcended the rather limited kind of mono-level approach to mediation, which tended to work at the diplomatic level, tended to work between the main players in any conflict. And just to finish this point, James, but you refer to Trump's peacemaking, his obsession with having successors so he can get the Nobel Prize. But the sort of peacemaking that he's been doing, if you think about, well, the 7 or 8 cases he claims he's already settled, but also Ukraine and Gaza, is very basic mediation, throwing out a carrot, using a stick, getting the main power actors together, not telling them what kind of settlement leads to long-term peace, just simply saying, find a quick fix, a short-term solution which settles your security and economic interests. So that's back to the future. It's taking us back to much older approaches to peacemaking, which all failed in the past. And their failure in the past, whether it was in 19th century Europe or in 20th century total war, led to the need to build this much bigger architecture, international peace architecture of peacemaking.
I think sort of, we've known each other for a very, very long time. And I'm sort of reminded in what you said for the audience, a bit of a reveal, that we actually did our PhDs at the same time in the same department, with the same supervisor. So we go back a long way. But I'm actually reminded in what we're talking about is that we looked at very different aspects of peace when we were doing our theses. I mean, you were very much interested in that peacemaking approach, and I was working on peacekeeping. And I think one of the things that sort of came out from what you were saying just now very much reminded me of the case of Cyprus, which we both know very, very well. And one of the critiques that's been put forward is that, and I think that sometimes, this seems to echo into other cases, is that the UN in its way has become remarkably good at stopping the violence, maybe a little too good, because it then becomes very difficult to translate that into workable final peace settlements. So essentially put, there's, I'm trying to get to the old argument that does peacekeeping prevent peacemaking?
It's a paradox because peacekeeping has proven absolutely essential to removing the immediacy of violence, the direct violence, and secondly, to providing a platform upon which diplomacy and mediation can take place. And normally it starts with this very elite, very constrained type of mediation of old, and then expands. And we have seen that happening in Cyprus. Peacekeeping was brought in to prevent a regional escalation of the conflict, which had Cold War parameters and risks. And on top of that, very early on, the UN had realized with its experiences, particularly in the DRC, but also in the Middle East, that you needed to have a political process. And it very, very soon became apparent in the Cyprus case that a political process had to go somewhere. Otherwise, it got stuck and you got trapped in a long-standing, aimless political process supported by peacekeepers who wanted to leave. Otherwise, they would be seen as, if you like, part of the furniture, or even worse, neo-colonial actors who were just simply keeping calm, but were not contributing to an overall settlement. I think that's a kind of unfair way of seeing things. As peacemaking expands its parameters, as it has done, and its complexity, it becomes much more long-term, much more difficult to achieve, and brings in many more actors and many more issues. It starts to raise justice questions. Now, a victor's peace has the benefit of simplicity. It's based on violence, and really, it only comes about because the other side is totally exhausted. I don't think that's really a peace. And I think there's very little one can build on that. Although people have said to me, well, what about the end of World War II and, you know, the victor's peace that we had, which dealt with Germany, Japan, and the fascist powers, the Axis powers, and all the rest of it. I mean, surely they accepted the settlements that emerged after that, even though it was a victor's peace. But I think that's, at a structural level, it's a bit different to the kind of examples that we're thinking of, where we're thinking about civil wars or smaller scale regional conflicts, where the violence is relatively contained. So what's happening here is that peacekeeping does remove the first layer of violence, the most overt, egregious forms of violence, and it does provide a platform for mediation and wider, more comprehensive peace talks to take place. But that secondary process is much more difficult and much more complex. It does seem a bit, and I think maybe you will agree with this, James, it does seem a bit like we've cracked the first conceptual kind of process. We know how to do peacekeeping, although we haven't really been using peacekeeping recently for reasons that we can go into later. But we haven't really managed to come up with a plausible way of dealing with the second part, the much more difficult part, which is to build a long-standing form of political order that former enemies can get on board with, that provides the necessary justice resources and offers the appropriate channels in which all sorts of conflicts, social, economic, political, territorial, ethnic, linguistic, and so on, can be dealt with. And obviously that second thing is more difficult. And you can go all the way back through the history of political theory, all the way back to classical Greece, to see that they were talking about the very same problems, even back then. And, you know, their conclusions often would oscillate between a victor's peace being pragmatic and simple, and really the only thing we can achieve, because we can't solve the other problem, which is how do we build more wide-ranging long-term political orders. But I think we've made a lot of progress with that question. But clearly, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And the Cyprus case shows that. I mean, I think we know the parameters of political settlement in Cyprus. And the peacekeeping force has been absolutely vital in allowing that conversation to take place, removing overt violence mostly from the situation. But it's the political process that has to deal with the structural, the cultural, the ethnic, linguistic violence, and the justice questions that still remain outstanding. So that's the question of how do you build the good life? How do you build peaceful forms of politics, the institutions, the constitutions, the legal frameworks, and all the rest of it? And we do keep coming back to this problem of the state. I mean, self-determination, as it developed in the 1960s, 1950s, and 1960s, led to statehood. And yet much of the scholarship of the whole of the 20th century said that if we want peace, we have to have federation, we have to have loose global federations and organization. We have to have political systems which transcend the state. We have to get away from territorialism. We have to get away from closed, non-inclusive political systems. We have to allow for mobility and for networks to develop which transcend the state. In other words, the state is only one, if you like, developmental layer in that path towards peace. And in Cyprus, we see this, the state and the contestation of these two if you like, different state claimants, has been very problematic for the peace process. The solution was the European Union. We very nearly got there in 2004, but we know what happened. And that's the kind of nub of the problem, isn't it? If you are a negotiator, a leader in a conflict-affected society, your primary position is that you cannot give away the promise of statehood and sovereignty. And yet statehood and sovereignty is often the problem that you need to be able to give away in some sense, but it needs to be done in a broader format, which allows all of those rights and all of those justice questions to be dealt with. And I think the EU was the kind of model which emerges from, post-war Europe, which dealt with that in Northern Ireland quite well, but it hasn't quite got there in the context of Cyprus, because there's still a lot of focus on this contested sovereignty and statehood, and it territorializes identity, and it turns peace back into this potential victor's peace model. And I think we need to dispatch that. That's in the dustbin of history. It's never worked for very long. It's dangerous. It's unstable. And by the way, any turn towards a more multipolar order in the world today will probably end up in the same dustbin.
Yes, a rather depressing thought there. But I think another of the themes that sort of comes out from what you were just talking about, which struck me, is that you also spoke of this sort of more expansive type of peace operations that we saw with the UN, which went beyond that traditional peacekeeping and said it's not just about going in and putting troops on the ground to separate two warring parties, but it has to be so much more than that. It has to be about state building. But I know that you've also been really critical about some of these efforts that have taken place. And another region that we both know and we've both spent a lot of time working on is the Balkans. And I think that has been really instructive in many ways as to how we've seen some of those failings, not through one, bad intention or anything like that, but a sense that it sort of come in and hasn't necessarily recognized sort of local conditions, local practices, which again, I think harks back to something you were saying right at the start about different traditions and often the failure to sort of really incorporate those.
Yeah, I mean, we keep coming back to this paradox of trying to make peace through the state system. And across the Balkans, of course, we've seen this fragmentation of the former Yugoslavia into different statelets. And immediately that raises the question of, well, how do we negotiate centralized authority? Which territories does it control? Which communities or ethnic groups have their allegiance to which authority? The lesson that we, I think, have learned about this is that a kind of assimilation approach in which we have the nation state with one identity group, with one chunk of land, with clear boundaries. I mean, the very definition of sovereignty, going back to the Montevideo Convention, has failed, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, I don't know. But I mean, theoretically, it's rather fortunate because it pushes us to think beyond those. But in practice, it's very bad for people who are suffering the consequences of this failed political model. So, what we're seeing hints of, I think, in the very few, and successes is too strong a word, but openings, if you like, that we've seen in peacemaking over the last 100 or so years, is that we need to design ways to transcend the things that divide us, because it's the things that divide us that create these polarizing forces upon which military and economic extraction and territorial dominance can emerge. So that's why the EU is very important. Although the EU has hard external boundaries, it also has tried to integrate and engage with very different histories and communities and traditions internally, as well as around its borders, if you like. The question of its borders has been a problem, I think, and this is why we have this age-old discussion within the EU about expansion and contraction. I mean, when you start to think territorially with boundaries around you, then you have to address this question of who do you include? And this is absolutely fundamental to peacemaking. Who do you include? I mean, you include the victors and the victims. So once you start doing that, then where do you draw boundaries? Or do you try to get rid of boundaries? Now, the one main success that we've seen with modern peacemaking has been the Northern Ireland. case.
Mm.
Things fell into place in Northern Ireland, although, of course, there are many problems with implementation and so on since. But it was the ability to think about multiple sources of authority, to move beyond boundaries, to try to deterritorialize the public good, and to do that within the European framework in which Britain and the US and the European powers were able to support with very decisive material resources. That's also lacking from most other peacemaking processes, which are generally underfunded, massively underfunded, because there are also development questions about socioeconomic inequality, stratification, race, class, and gender come into these kinds of discussions. Northern Ireland was perhaps a bit more homogenous. It was already in the EU. The main actors involved in this conflict had decided that they were interested in peace. They were going to do it in a more experimental way, and that they could find ways of maintaining their claims of self-determination and identity, as well as while also moving beyond the sort of territorialism that went with that in the past. And that creates all kinds of openings. And I think it's very instructive for peacemaking all around the world. And I think we see those kinds of dynamics with the more comprehensive and the more complex approaches that have emerged, where we are realizing that we need to be more inclusive amongst local communities and different groups in society, that we need to transcend boundaries, and also we need to think about wider federations. And any peace agreement and any peace-kept state which has signed off on those agreements also needs to join the regional and wider international community for reasons of trade, as well as for mobility, and just to build wider networks. And it's those networks, this complex interdependence, that really cements the agreement and expands it beyond the parameters of elite interests. So we've got a lot of this going on. Just to go back to Cyprus, in the Cyprus case, it's just not been formally signed off on. It was formally signed off on in Northern Ireland, which makes it look a lot neater. But in the Cyprus case, de facto, a lot of those things are there. The EU is present. We do have channels of communication and trade going on, not just on the island, but across the region. The guarantor powers have more or less all agreed that they want some kind of settlements, and that their red lines can accommodate each other's positions. What makes it really, really difficult is, and this is a pattern which we see across peacemaking all around the world, is that international attention and resource application is in constant flux. So you never have clear political will or clear backup for peacemaking. The electoral cycle amongst the contributing countries, the supporting countries, those that are sending in funds and diplomats and mediators, is fickle, as well as the domestic, local electoral cycles tends to slow things down. And so we get back to this idea that peacemaking is not just about signing an agreement around a table amongst the great men of the day, as it were, but is a social process which is long-term and involves huge amounts of contact, involves opening up new channels for that contact and building networks which transcend, to put it bluntly, the old imperial and elite systems of politics upon which we are building. So there's this contradiction. We're building peace on these old systems, which create all these complexities and these problems for us. And we have to respond to them. But we can't get rid of those old systems, because those old systems are also, in their own way, contributing to peace in some sense as well.
I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Many thanks. And now back to the interview.
Wow.
Yeah, I think sort of listening to this, I think that the point you made about Northern Ireland is something that I had always felt was incredibly instructive in my dealings with the Balkans, and trying to explain that within the bounds of the European Union, that it had created a system where you had two very distinct and diverse understandings of self-determination. One community that wanted to be part of the United Kingdom, the other that wanted to be part of the United Ireland, and somehow managed to create conditions that would say, although there may be a British flag flying over Northern Ireland, for those who felt themselves to be Irish in the more in the broadest understanding of it, of a united Ireland, there was no operational day-to-day boundary that existed, that they could exist in that framework very effectively, coupled with the fact that also it had been accepted that there would be a vote on a united Ireland at some point, that there was
Yeah,
that territorial aspect.
yeah,
But I often felt that that provided a really interesting framework for the Balkans, which was never really, I mean, I think it was constrained by the fact that as Northern Ireland really did depend on the European Union, as I think you sort of brought in. And I think that this is often missed, isn't it, by many outsiders, to how important that European Union framework is. I speak obviously as somebody who's very pro EU and has seen the value of it. But can I
mm,
just contrast this then?
mm,
Because Trump, we've
mm,
already mentioned,
mm,
but this stands in such opposition to so much of what you've been talking about. And I think you very neatly sort of highlighted the problem that he is working to a very old-fashioned, outdated understanding of, you come in and you say, right, okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, we have a peace deal, that's it, solved. And I think this came out really clearly with Gaza, which ironically was actually better received
mm,
than I think many expected. But then we've also seen it with this awful plan that was put forward, Ukraine, where there was no fleshing it out. And you and I, we've worked on peace processes. You know, even in the Gaza case, some of those bullet points made a lot of sense, but they seemed just so lacking in any detail as to how it was going to be implemented, how it would be operationalized. Um,
yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is, uh, how do we understand Trump's peacemaking? It just seems, as you said, it just seems so shallow and laying the conditions for a return to conflict in so many of these cases.
I think it's a kind of reaction to the attempt under US hegemony since the end of the Cold War, but also from before that, to create this more homogenous, aligned system for peacemaking where, civil society authorizes the state. They have common values and outlooks, and the state is part of an international community which authorizes, but also checks and balances the state and goes beyond the state and supports civil society. And this is kind of a virtuous, very elegant model of peacemaking, if you like, under liberalism, where humans are rights-bearing agents, and security and prosperity and the good life is one of those rights. And the state's job is to facilitate that. And the international role is to make sure the state behaves themselves and to give support where necessary to societies that are coming out of conflict. Now, this has come in for a lot of flack. As I've said, it's been unstable, in flux in practice. So we have very different examples of it from the post-Cold War period. If you compare Bosnia with Kosovo, with Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Colombia, and so on. I mean, there's a real complexity, a difference in focus in each of those cases, and Northern Ireland and so on. As I said earlier, Northern Ireland has benefited from a lot of material resources which the others would never get. But the parameters are quite similar, aren't they? The parameters are that individuals have human rights, that power is exchanged through democracy and not through war, and that for much of the rest of the time, your transactions are constrained by law for the good of all. That's the liberal model, and it goes all the way from the bottom all the way up to the top. That system seems to have exhausted itself. And, if you think about the way in which US foreign policy is reacting to the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, where that was also tried through the UN and also bilaterally as well, and unilaterally. I guess the conclusion, a superficial conclusion, would be the liberal model doesn't work. So what is the world clamoring for, if you like, when it comes to peace and development and security and stability? They want their own say. So it's a short step from there to say, well, look, in the past, we had this system where every great power had their regional terrain, their regional interests, and that was theirs. And they could do what they wanted in those sorts of regions and areas. So then you had this kind of imperial competition, emerging. Because the problem with that multipolar argument is that there are very difficult boundaries between each pole. And the tools we have for peacemaking between those poles are non-existent if the global system of peacemaking, i.e. the UN, and the development agencies, donors, and so on is dismembered or unable to operate. And the second part of that problem is that then we're saying, well, we don't really think that there is a kind of solution to the problem of peaceful political order domestically. So we're not going around as part of our peacemaking settlements trying to inculcate democracy, free trade, and human rights, etc. And what we're doing is saying, well, your authority is over that terrain. So what happens there is up to you. So you have internal pressures building too, because if you're not applying what we know about best practice and best systems in politics domestically, then you're going to be constantly struggling, and there will be the temptation to resort to the use of force and to have top-down, overweening forms of authoritarianism, autocracy, and all the rest of it. And they will spill over into regional conflicts because there'll be boundary issues, which will be forever there. And because you don't have an international system which is capable of mediating those boundary issues, then at the very best, you will have one or two great power actors saying, well, how do we reorganize things so you stop fighting? Let the victor take the spoils. And this is what Trump is basically doing, I think, in these two cases, isn't he? He's basically saying, so, peacemaking today is about probably, I mean, we're reading between the lines and we're extending the analysis. So we're putting words into his mouth. But if they want to have an authoritarian state after a peace settlement, that's fine. If it's going to build pressures, okay, well, that means they have to use force. If there are going to be boundary issues, well, they have to use overwhelming force. So that means peacemaking today is about elite diplomacy. It's about the reorganization and the movement of military forces and technology, and particularly with the new technology for warfighting that's come into play. It's about forced migration, moving populations, population exchanges, and these sorts of things. And it's not about justice, it's not about human rights, and it's not about democracy. Peacemaking today will not have any international organizations. It will be run through regional conferences, which means we're back to the old story of a major great power actor flying in and banging heads together and saying sign here on the dotted line for a very small limited agreement, because the wide complexity of issues are too difficult. So that means what you end up with is a carving off of the most difficult things and a settlement on the easier, plausible things that can be achieved through the balance of power or the use of force. So we end up with an authoritarian peace, and this is quite revisionist, because what it means is you're unpacking 100 years of pro-peace institution building, both domestically and internationally, and you're taking the international system back to the 19th century balance of power system that people like Henry Kissinger so loved, which failed. I don't think we can say the liberal international order has actually failed. We can say it's been ragged, but I mean, seriously, the greatest period of peace relative and prosperity relative has been in the period of the liberal international order. So I think we should be building on that, not going back to that older model of force-based authoritarian forms of peacemaking, which will just simply let loose revolutionary forces all over again, all over the world, challenges to domination and overweening power. Much, much worse than trusteeship in Bosnia. I mean, I find a lot of the discussion of the role of the OHR is rather hysterical and exaggerated. I mean, I think in a way, I mean, trying to enforce human rights and to prevent the egregious uses of power for reasons, for bad reasons, is a sensible thing for a mediator or a mediating institution to be doing. The less of that we have happening, the more conflict, the more it joins up, the more escalation. The risk is regional and global conflict. That's always what's emerged from multipolar phases in world history.
I completely agree. I am genuinely very worried about the direction things have taken. I completely agree on the assessment that, look, we can say that there have been flaws since 1945. We lived through that era of the Cold War, but it has essentially been a period of sustained peace. And we are now seeing it breaking down at an alarming rate in all sorts of ways. The fact that you now have a US administration which so blithely talks about, well, territory, countries should just give up territory. and returning us very much to that sort of 19th century great power politics, which I think so many of us are worried about. But how do we fix it? Have we crossed a point of no return where we might just have to accept that we're going to go through a period of instability until the world relearns the lesson? And this very much this idea that maybe part of the reason we're in the mess now is because that generation that remembered the Second World War has now gone. That historical memory is no longer. Do we need to relearn that lesson, or are we still at a place where it can be salvaged?
Well, the inoculation of war against war has been a long-standing pattern in human history. I mean, we do seem to forget, but that's why we have institutions, and that's why it's so important to defend institutions, and that does involve you in defending some traditions as well as being forward-looking, being balanced. In other words, and I think what we're seeing now is a very unbalanced phase in political thinking and practice around the world, where we have a lot of global South countries adopting rather ambivalent positions relating to things like human rights and constitutional order, because they are perhaps seeing the opportunity to reestablish some kind of regional domination or the domestic system of authoritarianism and take shortcuts to development. That's the Chinese model for peacemaking, by the way, the kind of peace building, debt peacemaking model, where you also build influence, regional and global influence at the same time. Has something in similar, something. There are some similarities too with between that and with the US model we saw after World War II. By the way, peacemaking has always been related in some problematic and difficult way to the building of regional spheres of influence. And you can say that a system without peacemaking tools will crash, will collapse. Throughout our history, when we have exhausted our peacemaking tools, I think regional orders have collapsed and states have collapsed too. And what's happened after that are the remnants of previous institutions of, let's say, social knowledge about peacemaking and of previous bureaucracies and political establishments have regrouped and sought to rebuild on the embers, if you like, of the previous system, learning the lessons of that collapse, but also learning the lessons of previous stability and previous progress. So to cut a very long story short, the history of peacemaking in its very long history, going back to deep archaeology, has always been about these cycles where a system is built up in which peace is kept, security is kept, prosperity grows, problems are solved. That system comes to the end of its capacity and collapses into war, violence, or sometimes just natural disasters too, because it's unable to deal with the kinds of problems that are emerging. And then on top of that, we build a new one. So then we get these layers. It's like an archaeology. The international peace architecture is itself a kind of human archaeology of politics. I think we're at that point now where the liberal international order has lost legitimacy around the world, in the global south, with Russia and China, and in America, with populist constituencies in the West. Many of those reasons are wrong, I think, are mistaken. Some of them are correct. It was hypocritical. It was too limited. It was badly funded. It was unstable. And we were never able to build on the kind of stability that was being developed through cooperative foreign policies, through peacekeeping and so on, to get to that point of a better political settlement. So we do need to solve that question. That's a question which echoes throughout history. In the past, solutions to that big question of how do we do the new politics better with more peace, with more justice and with more prosperity in a way that can solve great questions. In our time, it would be the climate question in particular. And the knowledge that's come to us to do that kind of thing in the past has always come from civil society, from social movements, from sympathetic political elites, people in the institutions that have survived. They've come together and they've used the rudimentary communicational and dialogic capacities that they had in those times to build global consensus, not necessarily for a global government or even a global federation, but a system in which states and peoples can negotiate and dialogue about their conflicts and problems, dealing with them without resorting to force. This situation we're in now, where the system is crashing, and we're searching around for this kind of wisdom, if you like, and this knowledge is quite interesting, because I think for the first time, and so not to end on a pessimistic note, we have such a wide body of knowledge, technical, scientific, scholarly, social, cultural, normative and ethical, as well as political, that this time around, I think we can imagine and possibly implement a new international system and new domestic systems which get round some of these problems which were built into the old system, which have caused it to collapse. So, I mean, I can't really go into the details of this system, but we know that we all live now today in very different ways to the way in which we lived in the past, when transport was limited, in which state boundaries were sacrosanct, in which passports and the right to travel were also quite limited, and most people didn't have the resources to have contact, global contact across networks, such as we're doing now, and the knowledge that passes around these networks is, in a kind of hive mind sense, far beyond anything we've ever experienced before. So the conditions are much more propitious. We have much more capacity now to come up with solutions to these problems. So this kind of reactionary turn back to multipolarity and so on, I don't think can survive for very long. The risks are too obvious. The risk of nuclear war, the risk of regional escalation, and the risk of climate failure are far too obvious to most people on the planet, as well as most of our political leaders, institutional leaders, and so on. So I think we're devising a system which will transcend territorialism, which will be able to deal with global problems like violence, war, climate change, and so on. That's not beyond the bounds of reason. But to get to that, we probably have to jettison some of that state centricity, some of that territoriality, some of this combative, competitive mindset, which leads us back to regional conflicts and those sorts of things. I think that's obvious to many people who are working in and around the fields that are relevant to this kind of discussion. So we could do it. We could come up with an international system in a new phase. We can build on the existing order. We can rectify some of the problems of the liberal international order, which itself rectifies some of the problems of the realist international order, the victor's peace model. And we can look forwards in order to deal with the kinds of problems that we see around the world emerging. And let's not forget the progress that we've made, technological, with poverty, with violence and warfare, with rights, and equality, balanced stability, and so on, over the last 50 or 100 years, tells us that we can do it again. But we need to do it, because it is existential, isn't it? If we don't do it, then we know exactly where Trump's peacemaking and the multipolar order will take us.
Oliver, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think you hit that right note at the end. I mean, the worry that I think so many of us have, but also maybe it is that sort of diehard optimism that we can hopefully find a way forward. I mean, notwithstanding debates about lethality of weaponry these days and things, but there is, I like to think as well, this hope that we can come back from the brink on this and understand that for all its flaws, we have a system that we can build on rather than try and remake from scratch in a very, very different way. Look, thank you so much for that. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a chance to talk again in the future. So
That'd be
thanks
great.
a lot.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.